In the heart of the ancient world, where the sun painted the deserts of Persia gold, an empire rose that would one day stretch from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. It was called the Empire of Order, built upon marble, fire, and divine will. To the Persians, their king was not merely a ruler. He was a bridge between gods and men, chosen to maintain harmony in a world forever trembling on the edge of chaos. His duty was sacred. His word was law. And yet, beneath the perfection of his empire's polished stones, something monstrous stirred, a shadow that whispered of punishments so cruel, they would one day be buried by time itself. The opening of our story is not about cruelty but about beauty, the kind of beauty that only absolute power can create. We see the vast palaces of Persepolis, their columns rising like forests of stone, every relief carved with reverence and grace. Courtiers move in silence, their steps measured, their eyes lowered. Every gesture, every ritual, every offering is an act of cosmic balance. The king's throne is flanked by golden lions, their mouths frozen in eternal roar. This is the image the world remembers: harmony, majesty, the first empire that sought to rule not only people but time itself. But history hides its horrors in the light. The same perfection that made Persia glorious demanded that imperfection be destroyed, and so, the machinery of punishment was born. Within the walls of paradise, those who dared disturb the divine order were made examples of, their suffering turned into lessons for generations. In this empire, pain had purpose. It was not seen as cruelty but as correction, a brutal restoration of the balance between man and God. The Persians believed their civilization was an imitation of the heavens. To preserve it, they had to mirror the gods' relentless justice. If a man lied, he defied Asha, the cosmic truth. If he betrayed his king, he betrayed the very fabric of creation. Such crimes demanded not merely death, but a death that spoke. A death that warned. A death that satisfied the divine thirst for order. The most terrifying punishments were born not from sadism, but from faith, the faith that the king, as the living reflection of the divine, must never show weakness, never forgive chaos, never allow the world to forget its fragile perfection. And yet, there is something deeply human beneath that divine mask. Fear. The fear of losing control, of watching an empire crumble under the weight of rebellion and doubt. For the Persians, power and fear were twins, inseparable, eternal. Every cruel invention, every execution, every display of pain was both a warning and a prayer. The empire worshipped order, but order was fragile, and it could only be maintained through terror. Imagine a soldier standing before the royal court, trembling beneath the polished gaze of the immortals, the king's elite guard. He knows he has failed, perhaps spoken out of turn, perhaps been accused of lying, perhaps merely angered a noble with too much pride. He does not plead. He knows what awaits him is not punishment but purification. The sentence will be public, the suffering prolonged. He will become an example, a message carved not in stone but in flesh. And as his screams echo through the halls, the empire will go on, calm and radiant as if nothing had happened. This was the paradox of Persia, the land that built gardens to mimic paradise, that wrote poetry about love and justice, also invented tortures so exquisite that even their enemies wrote of them in disbelief. To understand why, we must look beyond the horror itself. We must enter the mind of the empire, its faith, its order, and the divine shadow that justified the unthinkable. The Persians believed that everything had its place, the stars, the seasons, the souls of men. And when something fell out of place, it was not simply wrong, it was dangerous. Punishment was not revenge. It was restoration. Through pain, harmony was reborn. Through cruelty, the king reaffirmed his godhood. And so, within the gardens of paradise, the seeds of terror grew silently, nourished by belief and the fear of disorder. The question that lingers, and the one that guides this entire story, is simple yet haunting. Why did a civilization so devoted to beauty, order, and wisdom create punishments so horrifying that even time itself sought to forget them? The answer lies in the heart of Persian kingship, in the divine idea that power, once absolute, must never be questioned. To doubt the king was to doubt the gods. To challenge his word was to tear a hole in the universe. The punishments that followed were not just acts of cruelty, but acts of preservation, of cosmic symmetry. In the centuries that followed, their empire would crumble, their palaces would burn, and the world would move on. But buried beneath the sands, beneath the marble and myth, are traces of a truth too dark for inscriptions. A truth about how beauty and terror, faith and cruelty, are bound together in the human desire to control destiny itself. And so begins our descent into the forgotten heart of Persia, an empire that worshipped order so completely, it turned suffering into a sacred language. The Persian king was not born merely to rule, he was born to embody divinity. From the moment of his coronation he was wrapped not in gold, but in an invisible light known as kfarina, the divine radiance of legitimacy. It was said to be a flame that marked him as chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth and order. To possess kfarina was to possess destiny itself. The Persian monarch was not just a man who governed, he was the axis around which the cosmos turned. His authority was not debated because it was sacred. To disobey him was not rebellion, it was blasphemy. Within this ideology, every gesture of the king carried divine weight. When he raised his hand, armies moved. When he spoke, laws became eternal. The empire was not merely a political creation, it was a reflection of cosmic order itself, a living model of the heavens. Darius I, known as the Great, once declared in a royal inscription that he ruled by the grace of Ahura Mazda, and that his enemies were followers of the lie. These were not metaphors. To oppose him was to join the forces of darkness. His justice, no matter how brutal, was an act of faith. The court that surrounded the king existed in near religious silence. No one met his eyes directly unless invited to. His presence was overwhelming, both beautiful and terrifying. Those allowed into his audience chamber had to pass through towering halls lined with soldiers and carved reliefs of tribute bearers from every corner of the empire. The architecture itself was part of the ritual. It reminded visitors that the king's power flowed not from human will, but from the very order of the universe. To stand before him was to stand before the manifestation of divine will. And that divine will, once offended, demanded punishment that would echo through generations. The Persians had no concept of justice as we understand it today, no equality before the law, no notion of mercy as virtue. Justice meant balance, and balance meant preserving the king's divine perfection. If someone defied the royal decree, their guilt was not measured by intention, but by cosmic consequence. The king's punishment was not a personal act of anger, it was a necessary correction, a reassertion of order over chaos. This belief created a unique psychology, one where cruelty became sacred duty. The executioner was not seen as a monster but as an instrument of divine harmony. To the Persians, the empire's vastness was proof of the king's righteousness. He ruled over dozens of nations, from the mountains of Armenia to the valleys of India, each one submitting not just to his armies, but to the concept of cosmic truth he embodied. This gave his punishments a symbolic power that extended far beyond the victim. A single act of cruelty, witnessed by thousands, was meant to purify the moral fabric of the empire. The punishment of one became the salvation of many. In that logic, mercy was dangerous, because mercy allowed corruption to live. It was this blend of divinity and politics that made the Persian throne both magnificent and terrifying. The king's robes were embroidered with images of lions devouring prey, the eternal reminder that power is maintained through fear. His diadem was shaped like the sun, symbolizing his divine light, yet beneath that glow lurked shadows deeper than night. The same man who commissioned gardens to mirror paradise also devised punishments meant to remind mortals of their place in creation. Beauty and terror became the twin pillars of Persian authority. Imagine standing in Persepolis during the festival of Nowruz, when envoys from across the empire brought gifts to the king. Gold, ivory, silk, lapis lazuli, the treasures of the world poured at his feet. The air was perfumed, the music divine. Yet somewhere, in a chamber hidden from sight, a man awaited his fate. His crime might have been blasphemy, treason, or a whisper of disloyalty. His punishment would not be swift. It would be crafted, deliberate, and symbolic. A reminder to all that the harmony of the world depended on obedience to the throne. The king's justice was absolute because it was believed to be the god's justice. In his mind he did not kill, he cleansed. When a corrupt judge was found guilty under Darius, the king ordered that the man be flayed alive, and his skin stretched across the very chair in which he had once passed judgment. The next judge sat upon that chair as a living warning. It was more than vengeance, it was theology carved into flesh. The Persians did not see this as barbarity. To them, it was balance restored, order reasserted, truth victorious over deceit. This merging of faith and authority created a unique moral blindness, a world where cruelty could be justified as holiness. The king was both shepherd and storm, protector and punisher. His people worshipped him with love and fear in equal measure. Every victory, every execution, every edict reinforced the belief that he was chosen to sustain the fragile harmony between gods and men. To doubt that was to invite the collapse of the cosmos. And yet, in this perfection there was decay. The more divine the kings became, the more distant they grew from the people they ruled. The rituals of purity, the strict codes of obedience, and the unending fear of divine retribution turned the royal court into a theater of silence and suspicion. Servants whispered in shadows, nobles smiled while plotting escape, and priests guarded the king's sacred image as though it were the sun itself. The divine throne demanded not only devotion but constant demonstration of control, and control in Persia meant the ability to punish. As the empire expanded, the ideology of divine kingship hardened. The further the Persian armies marched, the more the king's image was deified, and the harsher his justice became. To rule such vast lands, he needed fear to travel faster than his soldiers. Punishment became not only a sentence but a message, carried from city to city, from one trembling heart to the next. The stories of the flayed judge, the impaled traitor, the blinded rebel, they became the invisible walls that kept the empire standing. The Persian king sat upon a throne of gold, but it was built on human terror. Every act of mercy risked disorder, every act of cruelty preserved it. The empire worshipped its monarch as a god because he was seen as the embodiment of truth, yet that truth demanded blood. It was a world where holiness justified horror, where justice was inseparable from spectacle, and where the divine throne itself became the crucible in which cruelty was refined to perfection. And so, the divine kings of Persia became inventors of fear. They built palaces that touched the heavens and dungeons that reached the abyss. Between those extremes they ruled, not as men of flesh and doubt, but as living reflections of a cosmic order too vast and too merciless to ever be questioned. Their thrones shone like the sun, but beneath that brilliance, the shadows grew darker with every passing century. It was within those shadows that the empire's most infamous punishments were born, rituals of pain that turned justice into theater, and suffering into sacred art. Power in Persia was never content to remain invisible. It had to be seen, heard, and felt. Justice, in the eyes of the great kings, was not a private affair. It was a performance, a divine spectacle that reminded the living of their fragile place beneath heaven's order. The Persians perfected the art of turning punishment into theater. When the king decreed a sentence, it was not delivered in darkness but under the blinding sun, before soldiers, priests, and citizens. The punishment was designed not only to destroy the guilty but to teach the watching world the cost of imperfection. In the empire's heart, fear was not chaos, it was choreography. Darius the Great understood this better than anyone. To him, the empire was a stage upon which the gods watched mankind struggle to maintain truth. Every punishment had to mirror that cosmic drama. In his royal inscriptions he declared, "I am not hot-tempered. I punish according to justice." But Persian justice was a thing of ceremony, not mercy. The condemned were often paraded through the streets, bound in chains of bronze, their names and crimes proclaimed by royal heralds. They would pass beneath the walls of Persepolis, their eyes fixed on the vast reliefs showing rows of tribute-bearers, figures frozen in eternal submission. The message was unmistakable. Those who served the king with loyalty were immortalized in stone. Those who defied him would be immortalized in pain. Among the earliest and most haunting examples of Persian theatrical punishment was the flaying of corrupt judges. Darius once ordered a magistrate, Sassanian, to be skinned alive for taking a bribe. The man's flesh was then stretched across the chair where his successor would sit. Every time that new judge gave a verdict, he felt the ghost of the flayed man beneath him, a silent reminder that the king's justice was both divine and watching. It was not simply torture, it was symbolism, punishment transformed into sacred ritual. To the Persians, the act was moral architecture, a piece of statecraft carved into human suffering. Another favored punishment was impalement, a method both horrifying and profoundly ceremonial. The condemned were lifted on a long wooden stake, sometimes alive, sometimes dead, left to hang for days as their bodies swayed in the wind. To the Persians this was not random cruelty. It was a deliberate image of disorder pinned to the earth, a visible declaration that chaos had been contained. Herodotus wrote of Darius impaling 3,000 Babylonians after quelling a revolt, their bodies lining the city walls like grotesque banners. Whether exaggerated or not, the act fit perfectly with the empire's logic. Punishment was a language and terror its most fluent dialect. The Persians also employed disfigurement as moral theater. Hands, noses, and tongues were cut off not just to punish but to communicate. Each mutilation corresponded to a specific sin. The liar lost his tongue, the thief his hands, the spy his eyes. The punishment had to fit the moral imbalance it sought to correct, and it had to be seen. The suffering of one man reinforced the obedience of thousands. In a society that believed divine order held the world together, punishment became an act of cosmic preservation. Even the setting of these executions was carefully chosen. Punishments were often carried out in public squares, near temples or sacred fires, where priests could bear witness. The executioner was not merely a servant of the state but an agent of purification. Each blow of his hand, each scream of the condemned, was thought to cleanse the moral fabric of the empire. Those who watched were not only spectators, they were participants, reaffirming their loyalty through silent terror. The pain of another became their reassurance that the gods still watched, that the king still ruled, and that the fragile balance of the universe had not yet fallen apart. Psychologically, this transformed cruelty into spectacle and fear into devotion. The king did not need to rule by love, he ruled by awe. The very sight of suffering became proof of divine justice. When the empire stretched across lands and languages, from Egyptian deserts to Anatolian plains, the theater of punishment became its universal tongue. A severed head displayed in Babylon spoke as clearly as a royal edict in Susa. Pain transcended translation, it was the one truth everyone understood. Persian chroniclers themselves rarely recorded the details of these punishments. Much of what we know comes from outsiders, Greek historians who both feared and admired Persian order. Herodotus, Xenophon, and Ctesias described Persian punishments with a mixture of horror and fascination, calling them the art of fear. They saw a civilization that turned suffering into system, a culture where cruelty had purpose and symmetry. Yet even they admitted the paradox. Persian cruelty was precise, disciplined, and restrained compared to the chaotic bloodlust of lesser kingdoms. Their punishments were designed, not improvised. In that control lay their terror. To walk through a Persian city during the reign of Xerxes or Darius was to live surrounded by invisible walls of fear. At any corner, one might encounter a man hanging from a stake, a head mounted at the city gate, or a body left unburied as a warning to the impure. Each punishment was an announcement of divine order, a reminder that rebellion was not only a crime against the state but a crime against the very architecture of existence. The Persian king did not merely kill, he corrected the universe. And yet, within that terrifying order there was brilliance. By transforming justice into theater, the Persians achieved something no empire before them had managed. They made obedience emotional. The people did not simply fear the king, they revered him because his cruelty carried the scent of sanctity. The executioner's blade became as sacred as the priest's fire. The victim's cries became hymns of purification. Every punishment was a performance designed to sustain the illusion that the empire was perfect, that its ruler was infallible, and that even the gods demanded such precision. But the deeper the empire perfected this art of theatrical justice, the more it fed a hunger for spectacle that would soon escape control. The stage grew bloodier, the performances more elaborate, the punishments more inventive. Soon the line between ritual and sadism began to blur. What had once been divine necessity became obsession. The king, the priests, and even the people began to crave the reaffirmation that only pain could bring. And so, justice became a form of theater, a spectacle where morality and cruelty intertwined. Persia had built a civilization of light and gold, but its foundations rested upon rituals of terror. Every execution was a sermon, every wound a verse in the empire's gospel of order. The theater of punishment kept the empire silent, obedient, and afraid. Yet within that silence, something darker began to grow, the idea that to preserve paradise, the gods demanded ever greater sacrifices. The empire that once sought to imitate heaven had begun to create its own version of hell, and the actors, bound and bleeding upon its stage, were merely the cost of keeping the illusion alive. In the great Persian Empire, mercy was not a virtue, it was a flaw. To the kings of Persia, compassion was dangerous, a weakness that could unravel the delicate balance of their cosmic order. Justice was sacred, and sacred things were merciless. In this world, the worst punishments were not reserved for the wicked, but for those who disrupted harmony, for those whose mere existence offended divine balance. The Persians did not invent cruelty for pleasure, they refined it as philosophy. And nowhere was that philosophy more horrifying, more intimate, than in the punishments designed to make men die slowly under the unblinking eye of the gods. Among all the nightmares conceived in that age, one stands apart: Scaphism, known to later ages as the boats. It was not merely a method of execution, it was an ordeal designed to erase the boundary between man and nature, to let the universe itself consume the sinner. Its victim was trapped between two narrow boats, his head, hands, and feet left exposed. The executioners poured milk and honey into his mouth until he could no longer swallow, smearing the same mixture across his exposed flesh. Then, under the burning Persian sun, he was left to rot on the surface of stagnant water. Insects, drawn by the sweetness, began their slow feast: ants, wasps, maggots and flies, turning the condemned man into a living hive. It was said that the ordeal could last for days, even weeks. The victim would scream, beg, convulse, and finally fall silent, his body no longer his own. The flesh became a temple of decay, a living sermon about divine justice. This punishment was not meant to kill quickly. It was designed to let the gods, and nature, decide the pace of death. Each crawling insect was a messenger of fate, each bite a reminder that no man, no matter how defiant, could escape the laws of the cosmos. The story of Mithridates, a soldier condemned by Artaxerxes, became legend. Accused of betrayal, he was sentenced to die by Scaphism. According to Greek chroniclers, he survived for 17 days before succumbing. By the time he died, his body was swollen, unrecognizable, yet his suffering was said to have purified the land of his treachery. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale embodies the psychological logic of Persian punishment. The condemned man was not merely punished, he was offered to creation itself. The Persians saw pain as revelation. Suffering unveiled truth. When a man screamed, he confessed. When his body broke, his soul was believed to be cleansed. Thus, the most terrible punishments were framed not as vengeance, but as purification. Scaphism, blinding, mutilation. These were sacraments of justice. The guilty man became a spectacle through which divine balance could be restored. And if mercy was ever shown, it risked inviting chaos back into the world. To understand this mentality, one must see beyond the brutality and into its purpose. Persian kings did not believe they ruled mortals. They believed they ruled moral order. Every act of disobedience was a crack in the universe, and the longer that crack remained, the closer the empire crept toward collapse. Pain was the cement of the cosmos. Punishment was how the fracture was sealed. And so, mercy, by leaving the fracture open, was a crime against creation. The empire's obsession with perfection demanded the annihilation of imperfection, no matter how small. There were other punishments, less famous but no less haunting. Burial alive, the silent counterpart to Scaphism, was reserved for certain sacred crimes. A man who defiled holy ground or a woman who blasphemed might be buried beneath layers of sand, her grave left open just enough for the gods to witness her final breath. This act, too, was not meant as cruelty but as cleansing. The earth, they believed, would absorb her impurity, restoring the harmony she had broken. Blinding was another form of purification. To see was a divine privilege. To misuse sight was to insult the gods. A traitor might have his eyes burned with heated bronze or gouged out with blades. A liar might have his tongue cut away. The mutilation was precise, symbolic, and deeply religious. Each act was meant to remove the instrument of sin, the eyes that saw too much, the mouth that spoke deceit, the hands that betrayed. Pain was not the goal. Transformation was. By destroying the corrupted flesh, the soul could be made pure again. In this system, mercy was dangerous precisely because it denied that transformation. To spare the guilty was to leave the world unbalanced. It was to challenge the gods themselves. The Persian king, as the guardian of Asha, the universal truth, had to ensure that punishment was inevitable and absolute. To him, forgiveness was rebellion against divine order. Even the condemned understood this logic. A man sentenced to death might kneel, not to beg for mercy, but to accept his place in the cosmic hierarchy. Some would chant prayers as they were led to execution, hoping that through agony, their souls would find reconciliation with the gods. In this way, punishment became ritual, a dark, sacred conversation between man and eternity. But there was a psychological toll to this divine order. The court, the executioners, even the priests began to live in the shadow of fear. To show pity, to hesitate in carrying out a sentence, could be seen as disobedience. Compassion itself became a crime. Those who hesitated were often punished alongside the guilty. The empire, in its pursuit of purity, devoured its own humanity. It is said that in the later years of Darius's reign, when the empire was at its most vast and its justice most feared, the air around Persepolis was heavy with silence. People whispered rather than spoke, bowed rather than met each other's eyes. Justice was everywhere, and because it was everywhere, it had become invisible. The people no longer asked for mercy because they no longer remembered what mercy felt like. The Persian kings ruled through this silence. To them, the absence of rebellion was proof of divine approval. But what they did not see was that beneath that quiet surface, the empire's spirit had begun to erode. Fear is an efficient tool, but it breeds decay in the soul. When mercy dies, obedience becomes mechanical, hollow. The empire's justice had become perfect, but perfection, like still water, breeds rot. And yet, for centuries this order held. The gods were obeyed, the kings were worshipped, and the punishments continued: flaying, impalement, scaphism, and burial, each more symbolic than the last. It was an empire that believed pain was truth and silence was purity. In time, these punishments would vanish, condemned even by later Persian dynasties as barbaric. But in their own age they were seen as the highest form of order, proof that the empire's moral architecture remained unshaken. The Persians had mastered the art of fear so completely that even nature seemed to conspire in their sentences. Scaphism, the burial, the mutilation, all were meant to let the gods finish what man began. The executioner's task was not to kill, but to deliver the condemned into the hands of divine justice. Once that was done, the cosmos could breathe again. The Persians called this balance. History calls it cruelty. But perhaps they are the same thing, two sides of a single truth forever at war inside the human heart. For when a civilization begins to believe that mercy is sin, its gods grow silent, its kings grow monstrous, and its punishments become eternal. In the empire of the Persian kings, power was a divine inheritance, but it was also a mirror, and nowhere did that mirror reflect more dangerously than in the lives of women. Behind the walls of marble and gold, beneath the carved images of harmony, the royal women of Persia lived in a world where beauty was both a weapon and a curse. The harem, that labyrinth of silk, silence, and suspicion, was a world unto itself, ruled by jealousy and politics, where a whisper could end a life and a smile could ignite war. Here, punishment was not public spectacle but intimate ritual. It unfolded behind curtains, hidden from the eyes of the empire, yet its cruelty was no less divine. Among these women, one name became legend: Amestris, queen of Xerxes' I. She was the daughter of a noble house, raised in an empire that worshipped power as purity. As Xerxes ascended the throne, Amestris became both queen and shadow. History remembers her not for her beauty or grace, but for her vengeance. Greek chroniclers wrote of her wrath with trembling fascination, a woman whose cruelty rivaled that of kings, whose punishments were devised with the same ritual precision as the empire's public executions. In her court, jealousy became theology. Amestris' story begins not with war but with betrayal, or what she believed to be betrayal. Xerxes, like many kings before him, took other women into his bed. One of them was the wife of his own brother. When Amestris discovered this, she did not confront her husband, she punished the woman. During the king's birthday celebration, a day when the king was forbidden by law to deny any request, Amestris demanded that the woman be delivered to her. Then, in an act of horrifying ritual, she ordered her mutilation: her tongue torn out, her breasts cut off, her ears and nose removed, her body left to the dogs. This was not chaos, not madness. In Amestris' mind, it was justice, the restoration of divine order through pain. The Persians saw their queens not merely as wives, but as guardians of purity, the moral reflection of the king's divine rule. When that purity was challenged, it was not just personal, it was cosmic. The queen's honor was tied to the empire's spiritual balance. Thus, her vengeance was sanctified. Amestris' cruelty was not an exception. It was the hidden counterpart to the empire's theology of punishment. The same beliefs that justified a man's impalement in the city square justified the queen's mutilation of her rivals in the palace chambers. In this hidden world of royal women, power was exercised not through armies, but through control, of access, of alliances, of fertility. A woman's womb was the empire's future, her body a political weapon. Infidelity, even the rumor of it, was treason. Adultery was seen as a defilement of the divine bloodline, a pollution of Asha, the sacred order. The punishment was absolute. Women accused of betrayal could be buried alive, their bodies entombed beneath the earth so that their impurity would be absorbed by the soil. It was believed that the earth, a symbol of the goddess Spenta Armadi, would purify the sin through silence. For lesser women, concubines, servants, slaves, punishment took on a cruel intimacy. They were beaten, branded, or disfigured, often at the whim of jealous nobles or queens. Yet even this cruelty had ritual precision. It was never called vengeance, it was purification. In a culture where beauty was a reflection of divine favor, to mar that beauty was to erase divine protection. Scars were moral sentences, carved by those who believed they were restoring cosmic harmony. The harem itself functioned as both sanctuary and prison. Its silence was deceptive. Within its walls, alliances were forged through poison and whispers, not swords. A single accusation, witchcraft, blasphemy, disloyalty, could seal a woman's fate. The priests who served the royal court saw the moral corruption of women as a spiritual contagion. If a woman was accused of bewitching the king or manipulating omens, she could be bound, her mouth filled with ashes, her body cast into the desert to let the sun and wind erase her from memory. Her death was meant to cleanse the royal household of her invisible sin. These punishments were rarely written down because they were never meant to be remembered. The Persian Empire, for all its grandeur, thrived on controlled perception. Its kings wanted to be seen as divine and merciful, its queens as virtuous and serene. The punishments of women existed in the shadows, in the whispers of servants and the diaries of enemies. Herodotus and later historians recorded what little escaped those walls. Not because the Persians boasted of it, but because horror has a way of surviving silence. There is a deeper irony here. The same civilization that carved reliefs of serene, orderly processions on the walls of Persepolis also practiced invisible rituals of vengeance and pain. The same hands that embroidered silks and tended sacred fires could, in a moment, become instruments of mutilation. The Persian worldview did not separate love from cruelty or faith from fear. The queen's punishment of her rival was as much an act of devotion to divine order as the priest's sacrifice to the gods. In both, pain became the proof of moral truth. And yet, even in that darkness, one finds complexity. Persian women, especially those of the royal court, were not powerless. Amestris, Atassa, Persides, these women could command executions, influence wars, and shape the fates of nations. Their cruelty was not born of weakness, but of proximity to absolute power. In a world where every act of disobedience threatened cosmic balance, they learned that mercy was a luxury no queen could afford. To be a woman in the Persian court was to live beneath the double weight of divinity and expectation. Every gesture was watched, every word measured, every silence interpreted. A misstep was treason, a rumor could be fatal. Even queens became prisoners of their own thrones, forced to embody a perfection that could never truly exist. The punishments they inflicted on others were often reflections of their own fear, the fear of losing power, of fading from the divine light that sanctified their existence. The contrast is haunting. Within the same palace walls where poets recited hymns to love and harmony, women screamed in secret chambers, their pain muffled by gold-draped walls. The empire that built gardens to mirror paradise had buried its own daughters alive beneath the same soil. Beauty and terror coexisted in perfect symmetry, as if one could not survive without the other. And so, in the story of Persian women, queens and concubines alike, we glimpse the empire's truest paradox. They were worshipped as vessels of purity, yet punished as embodiments of sin. Their power was both divine and disposable. In their hands, cruelty became a language, a means of survival, a declaration of faith, a reflection of the empire itself. When we remember Persia, we remember its kings, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, radiant figures carved in stone. But the true secrets of Persian cruelty may have belonged not to them, but to the women who ruled in their shadows. For within those hidden chambers, behind silken veils and guarded doors, they learned the empire's darkest truth, that power without mercy becomes indistinguishable from fear, and that in a kingdom obsessed with purity, love itself could become the most unforgivable crime. The Persian Empire was born in a land of extremes, blistering deserts that burned by day, frozen mountains that killed by night, and rivers that carved lifelines through endless plains of dust. Nature to the Persians was not a backdrop but a deity, a living presence that demanded both reverence and fear. Fire, water, earth, and air were sacred elements, each carrying divine power. But to defy the cosmic balance of these forces was to invite punishment not just from the king, but from the gods themselves. And so, the Persians built their punishments not merely from cruelty, but from nature itself. Fire and ice, water and wind. The empire turned the elements into instruments of divine justice. In Zoroastrian belief, the world was a battlefield between Asha, truth, order, and Druj, falsehood, chaos. Everything, from weather to human fate, was part of this eternal struggle. When a man sinned, he did not merely break the law, he sided with chaos. His punishment, then, was not human vengeance but divine correction, a way to return balance to the world. The priests, acting as interpreters of cosmic will, prescribed penalties that mirrored the elements. Fire burned impurity. Cold preserved purity through suffering. Earth absorbed the defiled. Water cleansed but could also drown the unworthy. Each punishment became a ritual reenactment of creation and destruction. The Persians saw the element of fire as the most sacred, the physical manifestation of divine truth. Fire temples, tended by magi, burned day and night as symbols of eternal purity. But if fire was sacred, to die by it was the highest form of condemnation. The Zoroastrian scriptures warned against polluting fire with human flesh, and yet, when the offense was great enough, the boundaries of faith could bend. Certain traitors or blasphemers were executed by burning, their ashes scattered to the winds so that no part of their body could defile the earth. The act was not seen as desecration but as purification, a violent return to cosmic order. Fire devoured the body, leaving only truth behind. But not all punishments were fiery. In the frozen reaches of the Persian highlands, another kind of justice awaited those the empire despised most. There were tales, half legend, half record, of prisoners left exposed on icy peaks, stripped of their clothing, their limbs bound. The cold did not kill quickly, it preserved. The condemned would feel the slow theft of heat, the creeping numbness as their blood thickened and their lungs stiffened with frost. The Persians called it silence by the gods. It was said that those who were too impure to be buried in the earth or burned in sacred fire were given to the air, left to freeze, their souls suspended between life and death, until the gods decided their fate. In this way the Persians turned their geography into theology. The harshness of their land became a reflection of divine justice. Punishment was not confined to dungeons or city squares. It unfolded in deserts, mountains, and frozen plains. A man might be buried up to his neck in sand beneath the burning sun, his body offering itself to fire and air. Another might be left to die of thirst beside a river, his suffering a reminder that even water could deny mercy. Every death was symbolic. Every scream an offering to cosmic order. Among the most feared of these nature-bound punishments was one whispered of in foreign chronicles, the Scaphism or the boats. It was said to have been used by the Persians for the most grievous traitors. Two narrow boats or hollowed halves of a log were placed together with the condemned man trapped inside, only his head, hands, and feet protruding. He was force-fed milk and honey until he could take no more, then his exposed skin was smeared with the same mixture. The sun drew flies and soon, insects laid eggs within his flesh. He was left adrift on a stagnant pond, the heat of the Persian summer turning his body into a living feast for worms. Some accounts say it took days, even weeks, for death to come. Scaphism was not just cruelty, it was symbolism. Water, once pure, became corruption. Life, once divine, decayed into filth. The condemned man became the embodiment of Druj, the great lie, consumed by nature's smallest creatures as punishment for his betrayal. To the Persians, his suffering was not meaningless. It was a reflection of cosmic justice, proof that the natural world itself could become the executor of divine law. Even burial practices reveal this fusion of punishment and purification. To pollute the earth with a sinner's corpse was considered a grave sin, for the earth goddess was to remain undefiled. Instead, the Persians exposed the dead on towers, structures later known as dogmas or towers of silence. There, bodies were left for vultures and the sun to strip clean. For the righteous, this was release. For the wicked, exposure was humiliation. Death itself became a trial. If the body decomposed swiftly, it was a sign that the soul was pure. If it lingered and stank beneath the open sky, it was said the soul still clung to corruption. Fire and ice, earth and air, these elements were both sacred and merciless. The Persians saw in them a reflection of their own empire, beautiful, ordered, and unyielding. Every punishment was a reminder that life existed only at the mercy of divine balance. The sinner was not just punished, he was transformed, burned, frozen, buried, or consumed, until he became part of the elements again. Yet beneath this divine logic lay something profoundly human: fear. The Persian kings ruled an empire so vast that its borders touched the edges of the known world. Rebellion was constant. Heresy, rumor, and corruption could spread like wildfire. The punishments tied to nature were as much political as spiritual. A man left to die in the desert was a warning to those who lived there. The empire's reach extended even to the emptiest sands. A traitor left adrift upon a stagnant pond became a living prophecy of decay, a lesson that no betrayal went unnoticed by gods or men. There is a certain cold beauty to this belief, that pain itself could serve order, that even in suffering there was symmetry. The Persians built gardens that mimicked paradise, where every tree, every fountain, every bird had its place. Their punishments followed the same pattern, precise, symbolic, eternal. Nature to them was not chaos but divine structure. And when man broke that structure, nature became his executioner. The echo of this philosophy still lingers. When we read of Persian punishments, they seem unimaginable, barbaric. But to those who lived within that faith, they were acts of devotion. Fire did not burn, it purified. Ice did not kill, it silenced impurity. Death was not the end but the restoration of balance. The cruelty was not senseless, it was sacred geometry, pain arranged in the image of divine order. And so, the empire that built its faith upon light and purity also turned its natural world into a theater of suffering. Fire consumed sin. Water betrayed the living. Ice preserved the condemned in eternal penance. Earth denied them rest. Through it all, one truth remained. In Persia, the elements themselves were watching, and for those who defied the will of gods or kings, even nature would become the executioner. In the vast tapestry of the Persian Empire, where the king was divine and the elements themselves served as instruments of justice, the idea of suffering was not random cruelty, it was theology. To understand Persian punishment is to step into the mind of a civilization that believed pain itself was a message from the gods. Every scream, every wound, every moment of agony was a dialogue between mortals and the divine. To suffer was to be seen, by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light and truth, and by his eternal adversary Ingra Mainyu, the spirit of deceit and darkness. Between these two forces, humanity was suspended, and suffering became both punishment and purification. The Zoroastrian faith that underpinned Persian kingship was built upon this duality. Life was a battlefield, every action, every thought, a choice between Asha, order, and Druj, chaos. The gods themselves were locked in struggle, and mankind was their reflection. Pain therefore was not merely human, it was divine imitation. Just as the gods endured cosmic conflict, so too must mortals endure their own trials. When a criminal was scourged, flayed, or left to the elements, the act was not only legal, it was cosmic theater. The Magi, priests of the sacred fire, saw the body's torment as the soul's confrontation with its own corruption. To purge the lie, one had to burn, bleed, or freeze, just as the gods suffered in maintaining balance between good and evil. The Persian kings absorbed this theology deeply. They did not see themselves as men but as divine mediators. Darius I, in his inscriptions, speaks not of conquest or greed, but of justice, of punishing the lie, of striking down those who deceived the people. The lie, in Zoroastrian cosmology, was not just falsehood but the very force of moral decay. To betray the king was to betray the truth of existence. Thus, every punishment, from impalement to exposure, was not just retribution but cosmic warfare. The condemned was not merely an enemy of the throne, but an embodiment of Druj, and his suffering became an offering to Asha. The gods themselves, according to Persian myth, were not free from pain. Unlike the distant, emotionless deities of later empires, the Persian divine hierarchy was visceral, tragic, and raw. In Zoroastrian tradition, even Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, endures the corruption of his creation. He suffers each time humanity falls to deception, each time truth is wounded by falsehood. The Yazatas, lesser divine beings, were not symbols of perfection but of endurance. They protected the world through constant struggle, their existence defined by resistance to evil. This divine suffering found human expression in the king's role as image of the god. The Achaemenid rulers, from Cyrus to Xerxes, performed rituals that mirrored celestial battles. Their punishments, their wars, even their displays of mercy were cosmic reenactments. When a rebel was flayed alive, the act symbolized the stripping away of lies from truth. When a blasphemer was buried in the earth, it represented the submersion of evil beneath divine order. The Persian court did not invent cruelty for pleasure, it institutionalized it as theology. The Magi played a central role in shaping these perceptions. They were philosophers, scientists, and priests, but also executioners of divine law. To them, the line between ritual and punishment did not exist. Pain was a form of purification, a sacred fire consuming corruption. During certain rituals, condemned men were offered prayers before death, not to ease their pain, but to sanctify it, to turn agony into absolution. Their bodies, broken and bloodied, became vessels through which cosmic balance was restored. Even the instruments of punishment, the stake, the lash, the chains, were considered consecrated tools, extensions of divine will. It is tempting to see this as mere cruelty wrapped in faith, but to the Persians, it was something much more profound. They believed that the gods themselves had set the example. In one fragment of pre-Zoroastrian myth, the hero Mitra endures endless battles against darkness, bleeding upon the earth so that mankind might have light. His pain becomes creation. His wounds sanctified. For the Persians, this was not metaphor, it was cosmic truth. The king's punishments were echoes of divine suffering, necessary to maintain the world's fragile order. This is what made Persian cruelty so haunting. It was not random violence but sacred ritual. In the Roman world, pain was political. In the Viking world, it was heroic. But in Persia, pain was spiritual. It carried the weight of eternity. A man who suffered under Persian law was not merely being executed, he was being transformed. His death was meant to speak to the gods, to remind them that the balance between Asha and Druj was still being fought upon the earth. Yet this belief held a darker irony. If the gods suffered, then so too must the king. For all his power, the Persian ruler was not immune to pain, he was bound by it. Every rebellion, every act of betrayal, was seen as a personal wound, a sign that the divine order under his rule had faltered. The king's punishments were as much self-defense as divine vengeance. He inflicted pain not out of cruelty, but to preserve his illusion of perfection, to convince himself and the world that his empire still reflected the cosmic truth. Imagine Xerxes standing before his throne, the golden light of the palace reflecting off his face. Behind him the sacred fire burns, eternal, pure. Before him kneels a condemned noble, accused of treason. The Magi chant softly, invoking the divine law. The executioners wait in silence. Xerxes does not see a man. He sees a symbol, the embodiment of chaos. As the punishment unfolds, as flesh meets flame or steel, the king watches with calm detachment. To him this is not cruelty. It is ceremony. Each scream is a psalm to the gods. Each drop of blood an offering to Asha. In his mind he is not destroying, he is cleansing. There is something tragically human in this divine detachment. The Persian kings believed themselves to be gods, but in their obsession with cosmic order, they became prisoners of it. They could not show mercy, for mercy disrupted balance. They could not forgive, for forgiveness weakened law. They became living sacrifices to their own faith, bound by the same cruelty they inflicted. To rule was to suffer, quietly, invisibly, beneath the gold and glory. In this paradox lies the heart of Persian cruelty. Pain was not only inflicted upon the condemned, but shared by the ruler. Every punishment was a reflection of divine struggle, and every act of divine justice came with its own shadow. The gods of Persia, like their kings, were not perfect beings of peace and love. They were beings of conflict, their beauty sharpened by suffering. The Persians did not separate holiness from horror, they intertwined them. The same fire that burned on sacred altars could consume a sinner's body. The same sun that illuminated the king's crown could blister the flesh of the condemned. In this, the Persians saw symmetry, an eternal rhythm between purity and pain. To them this was not cruelty. It was truth. And so, when the Magi prayed beside a dying man, when the king ordered a punishment that would echo for days, they did so with conviction, believing they were participating in something far greater than themselves. Suffering was not the end of justice, but its highest form. The gods suffered to sustain the world. The king suffered to preserve his empire. And humanity, caught between heaven and earth, suffered to remain worthy of divine attention. In the end, the Persian gods were not distant or merciful, they were mirrors of human nature itself. Their lessons were written in pain, their justice carved in flesh. The Persians saw in their suffering a reflection of divinity, and in divinity, a justification for their cruelty. For in their eyes, to suffer was to be purified, and to cause suffering in the name of order was to act like the gods themselves. As the Persian Empire reached the height of its power, cruelty ceased to be seen as brutality, it became a language of loyalty. The kings believed fear was the only force capable of binding a realm so vast, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. Punishment was not vengeance. It was proof of devotion. To disobey the king was to defy the gods themselves, and to suffer for him was to serve the cosmic order. In the grand courts of Persepolis, execution was ceremony. The condemned were not simply killed, they were displayed, their agony made spectacle for gods and men. The empire's officials recorded these acts not as crimes, but as justice fulfilled. Each punishment was crafted with divine symmetry: impalement for betrayal, burning for blasphemy, exposure for impurity. In this fusion of faith and rule, cruelty became a form of art, precise, deliberate, almost sacred. What made Persian punishments terrifying was not their pain but their purpose. They were meant to purify the state, to remind every subject that the empire's order was fragile, always threatened by chaos. And so, each public execution became a ritual of reassurance, a declaration that truth had triumphed, that the king's hand still guided the world. Yet beneath the chants and flames lay something darker, fear disguised as faith. The people watched and believed the suffering was divine will, but in their silence was submission. The Persian kings had transformed cruelty into a mirror of honor, and in doing so, blurred the line between justice and terror. When Darius or Xerxes decreed death, they did so with conviction, believing each drop of blood restored balance. But every empire that sanctifies violence sows its own decay. The Persians did not fall to their enemies, they collapsed beneath the weight of their own righteousness. In a world where pain became purity, even mercy was a threat. The ruins of Persepolis rise like ghosts from the desert, stone columns piercing the sky, their shadows long and solemn beneath the dying Persian sun. The wind hums through corridors that once echoed with prayers and decrees, carrying the faint memory of a civilization that believed its power was divine. These stones were meant to be eternal, built by kings who thought they had mastered both time and truth. Yet now, only silence remains, a silence heavy with the weight of forgotten screams. Persia's empire was born from order, but sustained by fear. To the kings, cruelty was not chaos, it was control. Punishment became the language of obedience, and pain the grammar of empire. The same belief that led them to carve paradise into the desert, with gardens flowing like rivers of heaven, also led them to devise punishments so exquisite in their torment that they defied the limits of imagination. For the Persians, beauty and brutality were not opposites. They were reflections of the same divine symmetry. The ruins themselves seem to know this truth. Look closely and you can almost see it, the contrast etched into every pillar. The soft curve of a lotus flower beside the unyielding gaze of a soldier. The carved faces of captives standing beneath gods of fire and justice. In their perfection, there is unease, as if the stone remembers what it was forced to witness. The empire's grandeur was built upon obedience, but that obedience was born from terror. Every act of cruelty carried the illusion of divine purpose, and that illusion, more than any weapon, held the empire together. But time does not honor illusion. Time erodes it. The same sun that once gleamed off royal thrones now burns the ruins bare. The same sands that buried traitors now swallow the names of kings. History, in its quiet vengeance, buries cruelty not beneath condemnation but indifference. The empire that once sought to shape eternity is now nothing but dust, its legacy scattered across half the world, its punishments remembered only in whispers. And yet, Persia's true legacy did not die with its stones. It lived on, in philosophy, in empire, in the eternal pattern of human power. The idea that pain can serve order, that cruelty can be righteous, became a seed that took root in civilizations to come. The Romans called it justice. The Inquisitors called it purification. Dictators would later call it peace. The language changed but the essence remained. Every age finds a way to sanctify its own cruelty. When we look back at the Persians we see not monsters but mirrors. They were humans, driven by faith, fear and the desire for permanence. Their cruelty was born not from madness but from belief. The conviction that suffering could restore harmony, that terror could preserve truth. And in that conviction lies the deepest warning history can offer, that the greatest evils are always committed in the name of order. Even today the echo of Persia lingers. Every time a government claims violence is necessary, every time pain is dressed as justice, every time control is mistaken for peace, the spirit of ancient Persia rises again, silent and unrecognizable but undeniably alive. The tools have changed, the justifications have evolved, but the essence remains the same. Humanity still worships the illusion that cruelty can build paradise. But the ruins say otherwise. The stones of Persepolis speak through their silence. They remind us that no empire, however divine it believes itself to be, can escape decay. The Persians thought they could burn impurity from the world with sacred fire, that they could cleanse rebellion with suffering. Instead they burned themselves. Their empire crumbled not under invasion, but under the weight of its own righteousness. For when cruelty becomes honor and pain becomes sacred, even the gods turn away. And yet, there is something hauntingly beautiful in their failure. The Persians reached for perfection, for divine order in a world of chaos, and in their reach they revealed the eternal contradiction of humanity. We seek peace but build it through violence. We worship beauty but create it from suffering. We chase immortality, but are destroyed by the very means we use to grasp it. As the last light fades over Persepolis, the ruins glow like embers, the remnants of a fire that once claimed to be eternal. And in that glow, history whispers its final truth, that cruelty, no matter how divine its disguise, always consumes its creator. Empires fall. Fates fade. But the memory of pain endures, carved deeper than stone, echoing longer than any king's name. Persepolis stands not as a monument to Persian greatness, but as a mirror, reflecting the unending cycle of human ambition and the price it demands. The empire is gone, but the lesson remains. When power learns to justify pain, it writes its own epitaph.